What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to tackle the assembly of some shocks and how to bleed them. So if you have any questions on building shocks for your RC car and bleeding them, this is the video for you. These shocks are the Big Bore shocks from Yokomo. They are part of the YD-2S Plus kit, which is a rear-wheel drive 110 scale drift car. Most of this stuff is gonna transfer over to any oil-filled shocks within the hobby. Bleeding process might differ depending on whether you're a bladder shock or not. I have done a video in the past on the team associated V2 Big Bore shocks, specifically on those shocks. So if you want to check that video out, I will leave a link to that down in the description. And let's build some shocks. And of course, like always, there's going to be links down below to all the tools and stuff I use in this. So if you want to check those out, click the links down below. They are affiliate links. So if you do end up buying something that you like, it does help the channel out. So check it out. Merch too. Merch link down below. Check it out. All right, it's shock time. So shocks I'm building today are the Big Bore shocks from Yokomo for their drift car. This is out of the YD-2S Plus kit. This would be bag 10. If you're doing the kit build with me, if you're just doing a shock build, this is gonna be a good little shock building guide as well as bleeding. So this is a good bladder shock. If you're looking for something that's not a bladder shock, I do have that team associated V2 Big Bore shock build kind of guide. So you can click the link down in the description below for that one. We are gonna get these shocks built. These are a lot smaller body than those team associated V2s because those were obviously an off-road shock versus this is an on-road. So we've got the 4 shock bodies there and they're actually square. So same length on all 4 corners. The only difference when building these shocks will be the difference in weight of the oil that we're using as well as the shock springs. It looks like we've got pinks and greens for the spring rates. However, these ones do have the nice red anodized parts, and it is a bladder shock. I can see the bladders in this bag here. So it's always nice to stay organized and clean when you're doing a shock build. That way you've got everything where you need it and you're not fumbling around for parts when you've got oil-filled shocks that you're trying to get caps on and everything. So I'm just going to get all this unboxed, get organized a little bit, and then we will get these built. All right, so like I said, being clean and organized is kind of the name of the game here. This one is going to use these little E-clips to mount the pistons to the shock shafts. So be careful with those. When we're working with those can fling off and fly across the room. Probably the most annoying part in all of RC, little E-clips like that. But we're just gonna get the pistons assembled here onto the shock shafts. So you've got 2 grooves, you got an upper and a lower. You can go ahead and put an E-clip on the lower. Just kind of line it up, push it in there if you got to use your table or a small set of pliers to kind of pop it on. You can kind of hear it click and then you'll see it's fully seated on there. So I'm going to go ahead and do all 4. I kind of like to do these in kind of like an assembly line type deal. That way you're at the same step and phase for every part of the shock build that you're doing. That way you're not building one shock completely and then coming back and building all of the other 3, you know. A little bit more time consuming. So we like to be efficient. But I will say that these E-clips are probably going to be the most annoying part of this. So if you can get these on there without rage quitting, then you're probably pretty good. So we got the lower ones on all those. These particular shocks are going to run the same piston all the way around. Now getting these top ones on for the E-clips, you are probably going to want a small set of pliers because you're going to have to line this up and then pop it on.
And the pliers, if you get the pliers offset a little bit from where you're trying to slide them on, that's when you're gonna fling them. You can see there, if you get the bottom kind of set in the groove there, you can see how it's kind of pushed in. That'll kind of set it, and then you can get your pliers. And then you can just pop it on. So I'm using my shock shaft pliers. Small set of needle nose work really good too. We're just gonna get the rest of these pistons mounted in the same fashion. And it looks like we have one extra E-clip. Not always a luxury that you are afforded when you buy a set of shocks. So keep that in mind, don't lose those. Now we can start kind of prepping the bodies. We're gonna have the upper spring collars that will have this gasket that has to sit inside. There's a groove just above the threads in there. You gotta get this worked into that groove. You can see like that, sitting nice and in the groove there. So we got to do that for all 4 of these. And this is basically going to keep tension on the shock body when you're rotating this collar. That way when you're driving the vehicle, the preload on the spring doesn't change. And we got all of those all set. All right, with these collars, all with the O-ring installed, we can go ahead and start threading them on from the bottom of the shock. To make it a little easier to thread, you can put a little bit of shock oil on the O-ring. It's gonna be a little tight if you don't do that. That'll just kind of keep it lubed up and easier to spin. Put just a little bit of drop of oil on there and then just kind of work it all the way around with your finger. That'll just kind of lube the O-ring, make it easier to make your adjustments. And I just like to wipe off any excess oil. Any oil that's going to be on the shock is just a dirt grabber, so it's just another place for dirt to cling onto. I like to keep things clean. So now we can get these all the way threaded on. Probably still gonna be a little tight, but that oil is gonna help out a lot, make it a lot smoother getting on there, a lot easier. You can see on the collar here, there's the knurled edge here, and then the little lip. That lip needs to go facing down because that's what's gonna capture the spring, so that's what's gonna retain the spring on there. You can thread them all the way up. Pretty much just go all the way up with them, that way we don't really have any initial preload when we first assemble the shocks, and we can do our fine tuning from there. It's not the most time consuming part, but it is the least entertaining. All right, we've got all those threaded all the way up. Basically just bottomed out the threads on the upper portion, and that way they're all pretty much at the same setting when we go to do our initial adjustments and everything. Now we can take the shaft with the piston on it that we assembled earlier. We can slide those through. Just get the shaft through the hole in the bottom, line up the piston, and you can pull that all the way through. And then we're gonna have an O-ring and a retainer, a plastic washer retainer. We've got to slide the O-ring over the shaft and all the way into that cup on the bottom of the shock body. This is the seal. And then you've got the O-ring, or not the O-ring. Then you've got the washer here. You've got a flat side and a side with a little lip on it. That little lip goes down. That's what's going to mate up with the lower collar for the shock. So you can take your lower collar there and thread it on and tighten it down all the way, and then that's going to hold the O-ring in place for your seal. We're gonna go ahead and do that for all 4 shocks. All right, we've got that done on all 4 shocks, and you can see the lip of that inside washer is flush with the lower retaining collar here. That's how you know everything's seated properly. If that's, you got kind of cockeyed in there and kind of sitting lower, then you know something's not right. You want to take it apart and fix it. But we got all those together. Now we're gonna need the lower ball cups, and we're gonna be able to thread those onto these shafts. This is where a good set of shock shaft pliers is going to come in really handy, because it'll allow you to grab the shaft of the shock and thread that on there and hold the shaft still and keep it from spinning without creating any etchings or cuts or anything on it that'll eventually deteriorate that O-ring and seal, and then you'll have a big nasty leak that you don't want. You can get the smooth part of the shock shaft into the pliers there, and I will leave a link to these down in the description below if you don't have one and you want to check them out. They are very, very handy for building shocks, and they come in handy for other things too. You'd be surprised how much you actually use them. But just go ahead and thread the ball cup all the way onto the shaft to where you stop seeing threads. So basically right when it butts up to the smooth part of the shaft, so there's no thread showing. You got that threaded all the way on. And then you can do the same thing for the other 3 shocks, taking them all into the same point. That way we have consistent build between all of our shocks. All right, we've got all those threaded on. They're all threaded in to the same length, so we will have consistency between all our shocks. Some people will actually measure with the fully extended. They'll measure the gap of the shaft on all of them to equalize them the best they can. So you can do that if you want to. But with that done, we're ready to start adding oil. And this is probably the part that confuses the most people, adding the oil and then bleeding the shocks. So having a shock stand is really going to be really handy. This is the Tamiya vacuum pump. So it's going to be a vacuum pump as well as it's going to be a holder for all of the shocks. So you can see you can set them in there and let them sit. You're going to want to keep these vertical. Obviously you don't want to spill the oil out, but you also have to let them sit for a little bit and get the all the air bubbles out. That's going to make for the most consistent shock. So you definitely want to get as much air out as possible, otherwise you start getting some inconsistencies in the shocks, and then over time the air will work its way into the piston while you're driving the vehicle, and yeah, it's just going to drive funny. We don't want that. This particular kit comes with a 300 and 200 weight CST rating. So we're gonna do 2 shocks with the 300, 2 shocks with the 200. Use whatever oil you are using though, determined on what you want to do. But I like to start with the shafts fully extended. That gets the piston all the way to the bottom of the shock body. So I'm gonna take the 300 here and do 2 of my shocks. You're gonna fill it up almost all the way to the top. You don't have to go completely to the top yet. We're not topping them off quite at this point. We're just filling it up, and then we're gonna have to work the air out of the shock. So right now there's gonna be an air gap below the piston between the bottom of the shock body and the top or the bottom side of the piston. So we are gonna have to work that air out. I'm gonna get all these filled up. So I did 300 on 2, and now I'm doing 200 on the other 2. All right, so take one of my 300s here. So you can see, hopefully on camera, I didn't quite go all the way to the top, but what you wanna do at this point is work the piston up. You don't wanna go above the fluid, you just wanna go kind of bump it up to the top of the fluid there. And then when you pull it down, you can see all those air bubbles that came up. That was the air that was trapped under the piston. So now we got oil down there, and you can go up and down a couple times just to make sure all the air gets out. I don't know how well the camera's picking it up, but there's a bunch of tiny micro bubbles working their way to the top. And how fast they rise is gonna be based on the thickness of the fluid. So the thicker the fluid, the longer it's going to take for the bubbles to rise. The thinner the fluid, the faster they'll rise, obviously. But I'm just going to go around on all these. Work the piston a couple times. That'll get the air from below the piston above the piston and the oil below the piston. And then, since I have a vacuum pump, I'm going to put a little vacuum on these. That's going to just speed the process up and help pull all the air from the shock. So you just basically want to sit and let the air do its thing. Sometimes if you're just sitting there, I mean, it can take up to 10 minutes, you know, just really depends, but you want to make sure all the micro bubbles and everything make their way out of the system. That way we have a very consistent shock throughout the run, throughout every drive, and we're not getting any air that works its way below the piston, causing some driving inconsistency and everything. So I will also leave a link to this vacuum pump down in the description below. Very, very handy for building shocks. It builds a really good shock. It helps pull and draw all the air out of the oil. That way, you don't have any air in the system. This is what I would call a pro tip. Still see a couple bubbles in there. Sometimes it takes a couple times with the pump. The nice thing is this pump has a clear lid, so you can see down and you can see the shock, you can see the oil while you're working with it. So you're not playing a guessing game of when to take the lid off. You can kind of look at it and see what's going on. Still some bubbles making their way up, so at this point it's just a waiting game. All right, no more air in the shock. So now comes the part where we're gonna start the bleeding process. All right, with all the air bubbles out of the system, we've let it sit long enough, all the air's come to the top and made its way out of the oil, so there's nothing left in the oil except for oil. We've got our upper retaining collar, our cap with the eyelet, that's gonna sit on the ball stud. And then the seal is actually this bladder here. So this is the upper seal. That's gonna get tightened down when you tighten down all this stuff. So to bleed these, keep the piston all the way at its lowest form. Then you can go ahead and top off with oil. Bring that oil level all the way to the top. And then what I like to do is, with it topped off with oil, is slowly bring the piston up. You want to do this slowly, otherwise you're just going to push a bunch of oil out the top of the system. But with the piston all the way at the top, rock the bladder onto it. And you're definitely going to want to have a rag, because you are going to lose oil when you do this. But that's good, because if we're losing oil, that means it's full of oil and we don't have any air in the system. So go ahead and rock the bladder on. You can see all that oil that just pushed out. And then you can go slowly pull the piston down with the bladder sealed, and that's actually going to create tension on the bladder and suck it into the body. And that's going to hold it in place while we get the lid tightened down on it. Probably going to have to hold the piston down, because since you're creating tension with it, the piston's going to naturally want to come up. So just hold it at its lowest portion there, but you can see that that's holding the bladder on. The bladder doesn't want to move, and there is no air in the system. So you can then set the little cap into the recess of the bladder there, get your upper collar and start tightening it down. Make sure that you're perfectly square when you start tightening it down, otherwise you can risk rocking the bladder out of place. And then if you do that, you're gonna have to start the process over again, because you're gonna get some air in the system and whatnot. But just tighten this all the way down. That bladder is what's creating the seal, so you want this nice and tight against it. And then you can see everything's flush here with the cap and the upper retaining collar there. And you can work the piston up and down. And if you have any air in the system, you'll be able to feel it. You'll feel the pockets of air going through the piston. It's almost like a crunchy feeling, but not quite. You can just feel it get really light at certain points. That's because you're hitting the air. So we'll go around and we will do this to all 4 shocks, and then we'll be able to put the springs and everything on. And I'll just mention the nice thing about these kind of reddish clear bladders is you can actually see if there's any air bubbles in the system. Like on this one here, you can see a tiny little air bubble there. But the clearness of the bladder actually allows you to see the fluid through it and see if there's any air in there. That little bit of air like that isn't too big of a deal, but you could do this over again and try to rock it in there a little better. To get 0 air in there. 0 air is the most ideal setup for the shock. That little bit of air there though is not going to be that big of a deal. That was a tiny little bubble. But pretty cool with the clear bladders there, how you can see. A lot of bladder shocks just have like a solid black bladder and you can't see through it. So it's nice on these ones that they're semi-clear and you can transparent, I guess, would be the correct word. All right, so all our shocks are bled and filled with oil, caps on, sealed up. So last part really is to put the springs on them. We've got 2 different rates that came in this kit in particular, a green and a pink. I believe the green is stiffer. So I'm actually going to match those with the 300 CST, but just slide the spring up the body like so, set it onto that upper retaining collar. That way it's sitting flat and not at an angle like that. Just make sure it's slid on. And then these have the nice red anodized cups there. So it'll just slide over the shaft like that, and then it'll slide down onto the ball cup, and then that'll retain your spring like so. So you got the spring fully seated in the cup there. So just go ahead and do that for all 4 shocks. It's the same process on all of them. And with the springs on, you have fully built shocks. Anyways, thanks for watching. That was kind of a little how-to on building and bleeding a bladder shock. These are the Yokomo Big Bores. Specifically, as far as bleeding the shock, bleeding would transfer over to any bladder type shock. Ideally, you'd get all the air out of the system and it would be the most consistent shock you've ever built. Anyways, thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. If you've got any questions, leave a comment down below. And as always, I will see you in the next one.